The stillness of the nursery was a palpable thing, thick and warm like honey, and Zuri Vance was content to let it coat her. Kneeling on the plush rug, her 8-month pregnant belly a vast, familiar weight settled upon her thighs, she folded a tiny onesie. It was a buttery yellow, the color of early morning sun filtering through curtains, soft enough to seem spun from light itself. A smile touched her lips, unbidden, as her fingers traced the miniature seams. She was picturing the swell of a tiny shoulder filling that space, the curve of a baby's back. The phone's ring, when it came, was a violent slash through the peace, a metallic trill that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. It rang once, a jarring interruption, and then again, more insistent. With a grunt of effort, she planted a hand flat against the small of her back, the other braced on the edge of the dresser, and heaved herself upright. Waddling to the bedside table, she answered on speaker without a glance at the number, her mind still half dreaming of sunlit cotton. Hello? The voice that answered did not belong to her mother, her sister, or any friend. It was a man's voice, deep and smoothed with an official cadence that instantly chilled the cozy room. It made the fine hairs on her forearms rise, a primal alert. Mrs. Vance. Zuri Vance. Yes, speaking. Her own voice sounded small. This is the Georgia State Patrol. Your husband, Emory Vance, has been involved in a single-vehicle accident on I-75 heading towards Marietta. The air in her lungs turned to ice. The yellow onesie slipped from her slackened fingers, floating a moment before settling soundlessly on the rug. An accident? Is he okay? The pause on the other end was an abyss, a vacuum where her world hung suspended. He's alive, ma'am. He's been transported to Emory University Hospital Midtown, but he wasn't alone. The last sentence did not land. It hung in the quiet nursery air, a jagged, unfamiliar shape. He wasn't alone. The initial naive interpretation surfaced first. A client, of course. Emory, the sales director for the Buckhead luxury dealership, lived and breathed his work. A last-minute test drive, a ride to close a deal. Who was he with? She asked, her voice fraying to a thread. We don't have those details in the preliminary report, ma'am. Just that the female passenger has also been admitted. You need to come to the hospital immediately. The line went dead. Zuri stood, the phone a cold, inert brick in her hand, her gaze fixed on the fallen splash of yellow on the floor. He wasn't alone. The phrase began to echo, and with each repetition its edges grew darker, sharper, more menacing. A tremor started deep within her core, a seismic shiver that traveled out to her fingertips and down her legs. She leaned heavily against the dresser, the wood digging into her palm, her breathing coming in short, ragged pulls. It wasn't a client. The certainty was a sick, heavy stone in her gut. It was something else entirely. Action bypassed thought. Purse, keys, a hurried shuffle out the apartment door. She didn't lock it. The world beyond her threshold had narrowed to a tunnel leading to the hospital. In the elevator's merciless mirror, a stranger stared back, pallid skin, eyes wide and glassy with a panic so profound it had not yet found tears. Her enormous belly, usually a source of proud strength, looked ludicrous now, a fragile bulwark against an invisible siege. The tears arrived somewhere on the rain-slicked streets of Atlanta, silent and scalding, tracking through her makeup as she navigated the upscale avenues. Each red light was a personal torment, every cautious driver ahead an obstacle of cosmic cruelty. The trooper's phrase became a mantra of dread, hammering in time with the painful pulse at her temples. He wasn't alone. Emory Hospital was a universe of jarring sounds and sterile smells. The cacophony of beeping machines, the swish of white coats, the low murmur of urgent voices, it all coalesced into a wave of sensory assault. The sharp, clean scent of antiseptic clawed at the back of her throat, triggering a gag reflex. She approached the reception desk, her heart a wild, caged thing beating against her ribs.
My husband, Emory Vance, he was in an accident. The receptionist, a black woman with kind, tired eyes and intricate braids swept back, gave her a look of practiced sympathy before turning to her computer. Her fingers tapped efficiently. He's in the ER, hallway B. Speak to the head nurse at the station at the end of the hall. The walk was a journey through a gauntlet of pitying glances. The pregnant woman, the desperate wife, she was a cliché moving through the linoleum landscape, and every set of eyes that briefly met hers understood her role. The hallway stretched, an endless, bright-lit passage. At the station, an older nurse with a stern mouth and watchful eyes seemed to be waiting for her. Zuri Gantz, your husband is stable. A fracture in his left arm, some bruising. He's conscious. The doctor will be with you shortly. The relief was a physical tide, so potent her knees liquefied. Alive, conscious. She gripped the cold formica counter, her knuckles white. And the other person, the one who was with him? The nurse's gaze held hers for a beat too long. A flicker. Was it pity? Crossed her features before the professional mask slid back into place. His companion is in the next bay. Minor injuries. The word companion lingered. Oddly intimate, clinical yet suggestive. The nurse held out a clipboard. I need you to sign here for his admission, please. Zuri took the proffered pen, her eyes automatically scanning the top of the form. There, in the rushed scrawl of some harried medical worker, was the information. Patient, Emory Vance, Bay 14. Companion, Nala Sterling. The name did not compute. It entered her vision but refused to align with meaning. Then it detonated. Nala Sterling. The air was violently evacuated from her lungs. It was an impossibility. Nala from 4B, the yoga instructor with the serene smile and the quiet, watchful husband, the woman who had knocked on her door just 3 days prior, bearing a jar of homemade peach preserves, her eyes sparkling as she asked, "Feeling the baby kick a lot?" The same Nala who had clasped Zuri's hand and said, her voice thick with faux admiration, "You're going to be an incredible mother, Zuri. I admire you so much." All the blood seemed to drain from Zuri's head, pooling somewhere in the frozen pit of her stomach. The clipboard slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a crack that echoed in the high-ceilinged hall. The surrounding noise, the heart monitor chorus, the page for Dr. Reynolds, the distant wail of a child, melted and distorted into a single high-pitched buzz. Her hand flew to her belly, an instinctive cradle for the life within, and her legs simply ceased to support her. She folded, collapsing in a slow, graceless descent onto the cold, hard floor. The world shrank to the sensation of unyielding linoleum against her knees, the chill seeping through her jeans. It was a blunt, physical anchor to a reality that was splintering. The nurse was at her side in an instant, voice sharp with concern, hands firm under her arms. Ma'am, are you all right?" Zuri was half lifted, guided to a rigid plastic chair against the wall. She sat, but her body felt like a borrowed, hollow thing. The weight in her womb was no longer just her son. It was the crushing mass of betrayal. Nala Sterling. The name became a toxin, circulating through her, rewriting history. Every benign memory curdled. The borrowed sugar, the elevator chats where Nala always steered the conversation to Emory. "He must work so hard, poor thing. You have to take good care of him, Zuri." Sisterly solidarity was now reveled as a grotesque performance. The sharpest memory cut deepest. The building cookout on the rooftop 2 months ago. Zuri, heavy and tired, watching Emory laugh by the grill, a beer in his hand. Nala settling beside her, placing a cool hand on the dome of her belly. "Can I feel?" she'd asked, and then, locking eyes with Zuri, she'd murmured, "It's such a magical connection, isn't it, between mother and child? Nothing can break that." Sitting in the hospital chair, Zuri understood the exquisite cruelty of that line. It hadn't been empathy. It had been a taunt, a villain savoring her own secret. This was not a simple affair. It was a campaign of intimate espionage, a play staged in her own home, with her as the unwitting audience. The questions, the advice, All of it was intelligence gathering, a way to gauge the depth of her ignorance. A young doctor with wire-rimmed glasses materialized before her. "Mrs. Vance? I'm Dr. Okoro. Your husband is out of danger. A distal radius fracture. Needs immobilization, but no neurological damage. He got lucky." Lucky? The word was an obscenity. "Can I see him?" Her voice was a stranger's, flat and cold. The doctor hesitated. "He's sedated for pain. The other patient is in the same observation bay. Perhaps it's better to wait." "No." The word was absolute, surprising her with its steel. "I want to see him. Now." Dr. Okoro studied her, the pallor, the storm in her eyes, the protective curve of her hands over her belly. He nodded once, sharply. "This way." The observation bay was shielded by a green curtain. He pulled it back. 2 beds, side by side. On the right, Omari. His left arm was cocooned in white, his handsome face scratched and swollen, eyes closed in drug-induced oblivion. Even unconscious, he wore a faint frown of trouble. Less than 6 feet away, in the left bed, was Nala. A bandage peeked from her hairline. She was staring at the acoustic tile ceiling, her expression blank, distant. She hadn't noticed the curtain's movement. Zuri froze on the threshold. The air became syrup, difficult to draw into her lungs. Here was the tangible proof, the brutal geometry of her betrayal. Her husband, the father of her child, and the woman who'd brought her preserves, sharing not just a secret, but a trauma, a hospital bay, a fate. They were a unit. She was the outsider, the redundant piece. Then Nala's head turned slowly, her eyes glazed and unfocused, drifted, then locked with Zuri's. Recognition ignited, followed by a conflagration of pure panic that twisted her pretty features into something ugly. Her lips parted in a silent "oh." The fear on her face was naked, stripped of all pretense. There was no remorse, only the terror of a predator caught in the light. Zuri held that gaze, feeling something cold and flinty harden within her. The weeping, the trembling, it all receded, replaced by a glacial clarity. She took one step, then another, into the room. She stopped at the foot of Omari's bed, her eyes never leaving Nala. He wasn't alone. She stated, her voice low but cleaving the sterile silence. She was returning the trooper's words to their source. The phrase visibly struck Nala, who flinched as if slapped, her eyes darting to the sheets. "Zuri, she began, a broken whisper. "No." Zuri's tone could have frostbite. "Don't you dare say my name." The only sound was the steady, indifferent beep of Omari's heart monitor. Zuri finally looked at her husband. The face she had loved, kissed, envisioned growing old with was now that of a stranger, marked by his deceit. She reached a hand out, stopping inches from his cheek. The right to touch him had been revoked. What they had built had shattered on I-75 with the neighbor in the passenger seat. She turned to leave, but a new, sharper pain lanced through her lower back, and the baby kicked, a strong, protesting jab. Her hand went to her abdomen. In that instant, she knew. It was just the two of them now. But there was one more thing to do, one final act of brutal symmetry. Pulling her phone from her purse, she scrolled past Omari's name, past her mother's, to a contact used only once, Kofi Sterling, Nala's husband, the quiet civil engineer, a man of few words, perpetually in the shadow of her effervescent wife. Her finger hovered. To call was to detonate another life. But the image of the 2 beds side by side solidified her resolve. The truth, however devastating, had to be complete. Their lie had 2 victims. Both deserved to know. She walked to a quiet window alcove, the Atlanta night now a black mirror outside. The phone rang. Once. Twice. "Hello?" His voice was just as she remembered, deep, a little tired, pleasantly neutral. "Kofi, it's Zuri, from 4B. A pause, the space of a breath as he placed her. "Zuri, is something wrong?" Genuine concern, likely for her pregnancy. "You need to come to Emory Hospital. Right now. It's about Nala." The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a universe collapsing inward. She could almost hear the connections being made. The neighbor, the hospital, the urgency, the absence of his wife to deliver any news. When he spoke again, his voice was stripped of all inflection, hard as river stone. I'm on my way. Zuri returned to her plastic chair to wait. The call had drained her. She was both messenger and casualty. Time stretched and warped. She watched the hallway's tragic ballet, a spectator in her own disaster. Her son kicked again, softer now, and in that movement, a decision crystallized. This child would not be raised in the ruins of a lie. Her love for him would be the compass that led her out. 25 minutes later, Kofi Sterling appeared. He moved with a contained, lethal urgency, his shoulders rigid, his gaze scanning like a radar. He found her. Up close, the mask was imperfect. His eyes were black pools. A vein throbbed at his temple. Something fundamental had been shattered. "Where is she?" he asked, the words hoarse. Wordlessly, she stood and nodded toward the green curtain. They walked together, an alliance forged in betrayal. She hung back as he pulled the curtain aside. The scene was unchanged, yet everything was different. Nala was now sitting up, legs dangling, as if poised for flight. She looked toward the entrance, expecting Zuri, but her face disintegrated when she saw Kofi. The air turned to glass.
Kofi took a step in. He looked from his wife to the man in the next bed, and the entire sordid equation solved itself before his eyes. "Nala," he said, the name a verdict. "What is this?" It wasn't a question about the accident. It was about everything. The late nights, the distance, the mysterious aura that had enveloped her. Nala began to cry. Ugly, gulping sobs of a cornered animal. "It was a mistake, Kofi, a mistake." "A mistake is taking a wrong turn," he said, his voice rising, cracking. "Being in a car with the neighbor's husband, that's a choice you made every day." He glanced at Zuri, and the full, vicious cruelty of it seemed to hit him anew. The pregnant wife, duped and mocked. His expression hardened into contempt. It was then that Omari stirred. A groan, a fluttering of eyelids. He blinked, his vision clearing onto his personal apocalypse. Nala sobbing, Kofi vibrating with rage, and Zuri, a statue of ice in the doorway. "Zuri!" he whispered, the name a plea. She didn't acknowledge him. Her empty gaze was more terrifying than any fury. Kofi turned his wrath on Omari. You ate at my table. You shook my hand." Disgust dripped from every word. Omari tried to sit up, winced. "Kofi, calm down. Let's talk." "Talk?" Kofi's laugh was barren. "The scene talks." He turned back to his wife. "It's over. Pack your things. I don't want to see you again." This was the precipice. Nala's desperation crested. "You can't!" she shrieked. "Kofi, I'm pregnant!" The silence was absolute, profound, swallowing even the beep of the monitors. Kofi froze. Omari's eyes flew wide, he hadn't known. Zuri closed her eyes. Her suspicion, that subtle protective hand on Nala's own abdomen, was confirmed in the most brutal theater. Kofi's face underwent a terrible transformation, a flicker of potential joy instantly annihilated by corrosive doubt. He looked at Omari, then back at Nala. The unasked question hung, poisonously. "It's yours, Kofi. Of course it's yours," Nala babbled, the words tumbling out in a panic stream. "I swear." But the oath was worthless. The timing, the secrecy, the use of it as a last-ditch shield, it all screamed deception. Kofi said nothing more. He looked at the woman in the bed, at the ruin of his trust, and the fight left him, replaced by a weary, final defeat. His shoulders slumped. He turned and walked out, past Zuri. His exit was a silent scream. He was gone. In the room, the 3 remaining players sat in the wreckage. Nala wept quietly. Omari stared, shell-shocked. Zuri finally moved. She walked to Omari's bedside. He looked up, raw supplication in his eyes. "Zuri, forgive me. Please, let me explain." "Explain what, Omari?" Her voice was calm, analytical. "That you cheated on me? Or that you cheated on me with the neighbor who pretended to be my friend? Or perhaps you'd like to explain how you did this while I carried your son? And now this?" Her glance at Nala was a scalpel. "You destroyed our family. For what? For someone who's pregnant and doesn't even seem sure who the father is?"
She didn't wait for an answer that could never come. She turned and walked out, leaving them alone with the consequences. The cold night air outside was a shock, a brutal clarity. She sat on a bench, letting the chills seep into her bones, numbing the pain. She wouldn't cry here. Crying was a luxury for a life that no longer existed. The phrase, "you destroyed our family," echoed, and with it came a darker truth. Perhaps the family had always been an illusion, a beautiful facade hiding fatal cracks she'd been too trusting, too happy to see. Omari's absences, his irritability, the new perfume scents, all the ignored red flags now formed a glaring banner of her own willful blindness. A nurse found her. "Your husband is asking for you. He's upset." Upset? The absurdity of it. "Tell him I went home," Zuri said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And the other patient." Her husband came back, there with a social worker. Kofi had returned, drawn back by duty or by that terrible complicating word, pregnant. Zuri stood. She wasn't going home. Not yet. From a discreet distance, she watched through a glass partition. Kofi, head in his hands. Nala, gesticulating, pleading, pointing to her belly. The social worker, a weary mediator. Later, through a doctor acquaintance, Zuri would learn the details of that grim conversation. Nala's confession was a tapestry of half-truths and cowardice. The affair with Omari was a rekindled flame from years past, but the cruelest cut was the timeline. She had reconnected with Omari after discovering she was pregnant. The child she insisted was Kofi's, conceived during a last-ditch effort to save their faltering marriage, had become the backdrop for her escapist fantasy. She didn't love Omari, she claimed. It was a weakness, a way to feel desired. She had chosen the thrill of a lie over the hard work of her reality. 2 marriages, 2 homes, shattered not by grand passion, but by profound, mundane selfishness. Omari seeking distraction from domestic responsibility, Nala using an affair as a band-aid for a dying union. They weren't Romeo and Juliet. They were careless children who had set fire to 4 lives and the futures of 2 unborn children. Watching Kofi stand, his final look at Nala one of utter, empty finality, Zuri felt the last ember of feeling for Omari turn to ash. It was no longer pain, but contempt. He had traded everything for a sordid, recycled dalliance. Kofi walked out, and this time he did not return. Zuri drove home on autopilot. The apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a museum of deceit. In the nursery, she picked up the yellow onesie from the floor. Its softness was the only real thing left. The next morning, she began the methodical demolition of her old life. Calls to a lawyer, a realtor, a moving company. She operated with a cold, surgical efficiency. Omari was discharged to an apartment already being emptied. On the bare living room floor, a single envelope awaited him. Inside, a copy of the accident report citing excessive speed, the latest ultrasound of his son, and a small note with one sentence. "While you were lying, I learned to live." He sank to the floor, crushed by the totality of his loss. The divorce was swift. Zuri wanted nothing but her fair share and her freedom. She moved to a small, clean apartment in Decatur, a blank slate. There, she built her son's nursery alone, each turned screw an act of defiance and creation. The solitude was not loneliness. It was strength, quietly fermenting. News trickled in. Nala was discharged alone. Kofi filed for divorce, demanding a prenatal paternity test. The result, when it came, was the final irony. The child was his. But the biological truth changed nothing. The betrayal was too deep. He committed to his responsibilities as a father, but closed the door on the marriage forever. Nala faced motherhood in the solitary confinement of her own making. Omari spiraled, a ghost in his empty apartment, his professional shine tarnished by the shadow of his choices.
3 weeks later, on a bright Saturday, Zuri's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Kofi Sterling. He looked older, harder, resolved. "Sorry to come unannounced," he said, his voice low. I needed to give you this. He handed her a large envelope. Inside was a copy of the DNA test confirming his paternity, and beneath it, a proposed legal settlement. It was staggering. Kofi was offering her the entirety of the substantial moral damages compensation he was seeking from Omari's dealership. In exchange, he asked for something that stole her breath. Not custody of her son, but a formal proposal for shared parenthood. He wanted to help raise her boy alongside his own. I don't understand, Zuri whispered, the papers trembling. It's simple, Kofi said, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. Our sons are the only innocent ones in this. They'll be linked by this history. Maybe they shouldn't be linked by the damage, but by something better. I'm not trying to replace anyone, but I can be a father figure. I can be there. They can grow up as brothers. A different kind of family. A patched-up one, but a family. Zuri was silent, the world tilting on its axis. It was madness. It was breathtaking justice. Don't answer now, he said, turning to leave. Think. Talk to your lawyer. I'm doing this for them. A week later, her son was born, perfect, with a strong cry and curious eyes. Upon returning home, she found 2 bouquets. One, anonymous, pleaded for forgiveness. It went directly into the trash. The other was simple wildflowers. The card read, "Welcome to the world, champ. Your brother is looking forward to meeting you. With respect, Kofi." Cradling her son, Zuri knew her answer. Her revenge would not be bitterness or watching Omari suffer. Her revenge would be to live fully, to build a family so uniquely happy, so resilient and loving, that the man who broke its prototype would become utterly irrelevant. She had not just survived, she, alongside an unlikely ally, was building something new from the rubble, something no one could have foreseen, a future written not by betrayal, but by a fierce, chosen loyalty. The days that followed her son's birth were a blur of primal rhythms and quiet revelations. Zuri named him Asher, a name that meant happy or blessed, a declaration of intent whispered against his downy scalp in the hushed 3 a.m. light. In the quiet cocoon of her Decatur apartment, with the city's distant hum as a lullaby, a new kind of peace took root. It was a peace born of exhaustion, yes, but also of a profound clarity. There were no more lies to decode, no performances to endure. It was just her and this tiny, demanding, miraculous human who looked at her as if she were her entire universe. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt wholly, uncomplicatedly needed and sufficient. Kofi's proposal sat on her kitchen counter, a neat, legalistic packet that belied its revolutionary content. She didn't call her lawyer immediately. Instead, she let the idea marinate, observing it from different angles as she nursed Asher or paced the floors with him. The traditional part of her mind, the part raised on clear lineages and nuclear units, balked. It was unconventional, messy, potentially fraught with future complications. But another, newer part of her, the part that had collapsed on a hospital floor and then gotten back up, saw its raw, pragmatic beauty. It was an act of reclamation. They were taking the wreckage left by Omari and Nala and forging from it a shelter for the 2 lives that mattered most. She finally called her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Brenda, who had handled the divorce with brutal efficiency. Brenda listened, her silence punctuated by the soft tap of a pen. When Zuri finished, Brenda exhaled slowly. It's legally creative, unprecedented in my experience. He's essentially proposing a co-parenting agreement where the children are not biologically siblings to one parent, but will be raised as siblings. It would involve trusts, visitation schedules, educational planning, the whole 9 yards. It's not a casual handshake. I don't think it's a casual offer, Zuri said, watching Asher's chest rise and fall in his bassinet. No, Brenda agreed. It sounds like a treaty written for the next generation.
The financial component is significant. It would secure Asher's future. But the personal component, Zuri, you'd be binding your life to this man in a way, not as spouses, but as permanent co-conspirators in raising these boys. You need to be sure. A week later, Zuri invited Kofi over. It was a deliberately ordinary setting. Afternoon sun streaming into her living room, the faint smell of baby formula and lavender detergent in the air. Asher was sleeping in a carrier beside her. Kofi arrived with a small, practical gift, a box of organic onesies in neutral colors, and an air of solemn readiness. They sat with mugs of tea, the legal document between them on the coffee table. "I've thought about it," Zuri began, her voice quiet but steady, "and I've spoken to my lawyer." Kofi nodded, his hands clasped tightly. He was bracing for a no. "I want to do it," she said. "Not for the money. The money is a tool. I want to do it for the reason you said. For them." She gestured to Asher. "To give them something solid, something good, out of all that bad." The relief that washed over Kofi's face was subtle but profound. The rigid line of his shoulders softened a fraction. "Good," he said, the word heavy with meaning. "I've drawn up some thoughts, a schedule, not rigid, but a starting point. Weekends together may be holidays, so they know each other from the beginning." They talked for an hour, not as grieving spouses, but as pragmatic architects. They discussed pediatricians, preschool waiting lists, their own work schedules. Kofi was an engineer. His mind sought structure, and Zuri found she appreciated the clarity. It was a business plan for a family. When he left, there was no awkwardness, only a sense of purposeful alignment. The first official family day was 2 weeks later. Kofi arrived at Zuri's apartment with a diaper bag that looked brand new and a slightly panicked expression. His son, whom he had named Micah, was a month older than Asher, a solemn-eyed baby with a surprising grip. The two infants were placed on a blanket on the floor, oblivious to the historic significance of the moment. They wriggled, waved tiny fists, and eventually Asher's hand brushed Micah's foot. It was nothing, a random infant movement, but Kofi and Zuri exchanged a look over their sons' heads. A start. Nala's shadow lingered, of course. The legal proceedings for their divorce were ongoing, complicated by the baby. Kofi was adamant about his paternal rights, but sought sole legal custody, arguing the instability Nala had shown. He was civil, but immovable in court, a fortress of quiet determination. Zuri heard snippets through Brenda, who kept tabs on the parallel case. Nala was fighting, using the baby as a pawn, her pleas shifting from remorse to accusation. It was ugly, and it reinforced every decision Zuri and Kofi were making.
Omari tried, sporadically and ineptly, to re-enter the atmosphere of Zuri's life. His texts evolved from pleading, "I've changed, I'll do anything," to resentful, "You're keeping my son from me," to finally just sad. "Please, just a picture." She blocked his number after the resentful phase. Through the lawyer, she established a protocol for supervised visitation once Asher was older, a cold, legal channel that felt like dealing with a distant and problematic client. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a source of bureaucratic paperwork. Meanwhile, the new family unit, this patchwork quilt of a thing, began to find its shape. Every other Sunday became their day. They would take the boys to the park or the Georgia Aquarium or simply cook a meal together in Zuri's or Kofi's kitchen. It was awkward at first. Conversations could lapse into a heavy silence, the ghosts of betrayal and hurt hovering just outside the circle of light. But the babies were a distraction, a constant demanding focus. Diapers needed changing, bottles needed warming, a toy needed retrieving. Through the shared management of these minute crises, a rhythm developed. One Sunday, while Kofi was burping Micah over his shoulder, he said, out of nowhere, "She asked about him. Nala. She asked if he was seeing Asher." Zuri, who was feeding Asher, went still. "What did he say?" "I said the truth, that Asher was being raised alongside his brother in a stable home."
He said it without heat, a simple statement of fact. She called me cruel. Zuri thought of Nala's hand on her belly at the rooftop cookout, the sugary words that had masked such poison. No, she said softly, more to Asher than to Kofi. Cruelty is pretending to be a friend while plotting to steal a life. This is just consequences. Kofi met her eyes then, and for the first time she saw something like solidarity there, a shared understanding that went beyond their mutual victimhood. They were on the same side now, a side defined by protection, not pain. As the months turned into a year, the awkwardness melted away, replaced by a deep, abiding partnership. They celebrated first birthdays together, a joint party at a community center with 2 smash cakes and a room full of friends from Zuri's new moms group and Kofi's colleagues. Omari was notified through legal channels, but did not attend. Nala, embroiled in her own custody battle, sent a gift for Micah through her lawyer, an expensive, impractical silver rattle. Kofi donated it to a charity drive. The boys, growing side by side, did indeed become brothers. Asher was the more vocal, curious one, always on the move. Micah was observant, calm, with a thoughtful gaze that reminded Zuri of Kofi. Asher's first word was mama. Micah's, intriguingly, was Asha, his toddler attempt at his brother's name. They shared a playpen, then a room, on family days, developing a private babbling language of their own. Zuri and Kofi never crossed the line into romance. The foundation of their relationship was not attraction, but a treaty. Yet within that treaty grew a profound affection and respect. They were each other's emergency contact, the person to call when a child spiked a fever in the middle of the night, the sounding board for career decisions. They built a life that was parallel, intertwined, and fiercely devoted to the 2 small humans at its center. One afternoon, when the boys were nearly 3 and chasing each other through the sprinklers in Kofi's backyard, Zuri found herself watching Kofi watch them. A soft smile touched his lips, one that erased the years of strain around his eyes. He caught her looking. "It works, doesn't it?" he said, not needing to specify what "it" was. "It does," she agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Her revenge, she realized, was this exact moment. It was the sight of her son, laughing and carefree, loved by a man of integrity. It was the peace in her own heart, a peace she had built herself. It was the complete and utter irrelevance of Omari Vance to her daily happiness. He was a figure from a past life, a cautionary tale, a signature on a child support check. The searing pain had been cauterized, not by time alone, but the active, deliberate creation of a beautiful new reality. The final piece of the old puzzle clicked into place, or rather was discarded, about a year later. Zuri was at the grocery store, Asher in the cart seat, insisting on holding the bread, when she saw them. At the far end of the cereal aisle, looking at a box of expensive granola, was Omari. And beside him, holding the hand of a sullen-looking little girl of about 4, was a woman Zuri didn't recognize, not Nala. This woman was younger, dressed in the sleek, expensive casual wear Omari had always favored. She looked bored. Omari looked tired, older than his years, his salesman's charm visibly dimmed. He turned his head, and his gaze swept the aisle without a flicker of recognition before landing back on the granola box. For a second, Zuri waited for the pang, the residual hurt, the anger. It didn't come. There was nothing. He was just a man in a grocery store. Asher, oblivious, banged the loaf of bread on the cart. "Mama, go! Cookies!" She smiled down to her son. "Okay, buddy, cookies." She pushed her cart past the end of the aisle, turning towards the bakery section without a backward glance. The past had no hold here. It had been overwritten by the messy, joyous, fiercely protected present. She had learned to live, and in doing so, had built a life so full that the ruins of the old one were now just distant scenery, seen from a great and unbridgeable distance. The story wasn't about the betrayal anymore. It was about what came after. And what came after, she thought, as Asher giggled in anticipation of a chocolate chip cookie, was everything. 5 years had a way of sanding down sharp edges and painting over old scars with the vibrant, messy brushstrokes of a lived-in life. The Decatur apartment was now a house, a modest craftsman-style bungalow with a wide porch and a backyard that ended in a tangle of Georgia pines. It was Zuri's house, bought with her share of the divorce settlement and the profits from her burgeoning freelance graphic design business. The nursery yellow had long been replaced by the colors of little boyhood, deep blues, forest greens, and the inevitable eye-searing neon of superheroes. Asher and Micah, at 5.5, were a unit. To the outside world, they were brothers. Full stop. They shared the same stubborn colic, though Asher's hair was a shade darker than Micah's. They had the same knock-kneed run, the same secret handshake involving elaborate fist bumps and a sound effect that was half dinosaur roar, half spaceship engine. They bickered over who got the blue cup and conspired to hide peas under the rim of their plates. They were, in every way that mattered, siblings.
Their family structure required occasional explanation at school or on playdates, delivered with a calm matter-of-factness Zuri and Kofi had perfected. The boys have the same father figure, Kofi would say, his hand resting on Micah's shoulder. We're a modern family, Zuri would add with a warm smile that invited no further inquiry. Most people just nodded, charmed by the boys' obvious bond and the easy, respectful dynamic between the adults. Kofi had moved into a townhouse just 3 streets over, close enough for the boys to ride their bikes between homes. They had a fluid, well-rehearsed schedule. Weekdays were split, weekends were almost always together, holidays were negotiated with the precision of a UN peacekeeping mission, always ending in a joint celebration. The financial settlement from Omari's dealership, which Kofi had steadfastly signed over to a trust for Asher, provided a security blanket that allowed Zuri to build her business, and Kofi to take a less travel-intensive role at his engineering firm. It was, as Brenda, the lawyer, had once dryly remarked, the most successful post-marital merger she'd ever witnessed. The ghosts of the past were not gone, but they were quiet tenants, relegated to the attic of their lives. Omari exercised his court-mandated supervised visitation with Asher 1 weekend a month. Asher would return from these outings quiet, sometimes clutching a new, overly flashy toy, and would inevitably seek out Micah, their private language serving as a decompression chamber. Zuri never asked for details. The court-appointed supervisor's bland reports, "Visit was conducted at the indoor playground, no issues to report," were enough. She could see the disconnect in her son's eyes, a confusion that had nothing to do with her or the solid world she and Kofi had built. It was the confusion of a child trying to reconcile the concept of father with a near stranger who smelled of strong cologne and struggled to make conversation. Nala was a more distant specter. She had lost her bid for primary custody of Micah. The court had granted Kofi's sole legal and physical custody, citing her unstable circumstances and demonstrated lack of judgment. She had visitation, but it was sporadic, unreliable. She had moved to a different part of the city, drifted through jobs, and her relationship with Micah was, according to Kofi's careful, non-judgmental explanations to his son, complicated. Micah called her Nala, not Mom. He would sometimes mention a fun afternoon at a movie, but more often he'd mention a canceled plan. His steady center was his dad, his brother, and Zuri, whom he had, around age 3, spontaneously begun calling Zuzu. The name had stuck, a badge of belonging. One crisp October evening, the kind where the air smells of wood smoke and fallen leaves, they were all at Zuri's house. Kofi was manning the grill on the back patio, flipping burgers while expertly dodging the boys who were engaged in a high-stakes chase involving stick swords. Zuri was inside, finishing a salad, the sounds of laughter and playful shrieks floating through the open window. This was the symphony of her life now, and its melody was one of deep, unshakable contentment. The doorbell rang, an incongruous sound against the domestic backdrop. Assuming it was a neighbor or a package, Zuri wiped her hands and went to answer it. The woman on the porch was both familiar and utterly changed.
It was Nala. The yoga instructor's glow was gone, replaced by a thin, sharp weariness. Her clothes were expensive but looked hastily put on. Her hair was a flat, dark curtain. But her eyes were the most different. The sparkle of false admiration, the later panic of being caught, all burnt away to reveal a hollow, desperate exhaustion. She held a large, gift-wrapped box. "Zuri," she said, and her voice was raspy as if from disuse. For a moment, Zuri simply stood in the threshold, the warmth of her home at her back, the ghost of her past on her doorstep. She felt no fear, no anger, just a profound, weary recognition. "Nala, I was in the neighborhood. I brought something for Micah. For his birthday next week." She thrust the box forward slightly. It was awkward, too large, wrapped in garish superhero paper. "His birthday is tomorrow," Zuri said quietly, "and we're having his party on Saturday." A flicker of pain crossed her face. "Oh, right. The card inside has the date." She swallowed. Can I see him? Just for a minute?" Zuri's instinct was to say no, to protect the sanctity of the evening, to shield Micah from the emotional whiplash this woman invariably brought. But she also saw the raw need in her eyes, a need that had nothing to do with malice anymore. It was the need of a drowning woman glimpsing a distant shore. "Wait here," Zuri said. She closed the door, not fully, but enough to create a boundary. She walked through the house to the back patio. The boys had abandoned their sticks and were now helping Kofi by handing him spatulas he didn't need. "Kofi," she said softly. He looked up, saw the expression on her face, and immediately understood. His own face tightened. "She's at the front door. She has a gift, wants to see Micah for a minute." Kofi looked at his son, who was proudly presenting him with a fistful of dandelion weeds. He sighed, a sigh of deep resignation. "Okay." He put down his grilling tools. "Micah, buddy, come with me for a sec. Someone's here to say hi." Micah, intrigued, followed his father inside. Zuri stayed on the patio, watching Asher poke at the coals in the grill with a long, forbidden stick. Her heart ached for the little boy walking into the foyer. From where she stood, she could just hear the murmured voices in the front hall. "Hi, sweetie," Nala's voice, trying for brightness and landing on tremulous. "Hi, Nala," Micah's voice, polite, curious. "I brought you a present for your birthday." "Thanks. We're having cake on Saturday with the dinosaur volcano." "That sounds amazing." A pause. "You look so big." Another pause, longer. "Dad says the burgers are almost ready." "Of course, I won't keep you." Nala's voice broke. "I just wanted to give you a hug. Can I give you a hug, Micah?" Zuri held her breath. She heard the rustle of clothing, the soft, brief press of a hug. "Bye, Nala," Micah said, his tone already moving on, back to the important business of dinosaurs and burgers. "Bye, baby." The front door closed. A moment later, Kofi and Micah returned to the patio. Micah was already tearing at the wrapping paper. Kofi's jaw was set, his eyes meeting Zuri's. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "It was fine. It's over." Inside the box was an elaborate, remote-controlled robot, the kind that was too advanced for a 5-year-old and required assembly by a mechanical engineer. Micah looked at it, puzzled. "Cool," he said, before his attention was recaptured by the smell of cooking meat. "Dad, is mine without pickles?" The robot was later placed in the closet, a monument to disconnected generosity. The evening resumed its comfortable rhythm. But the visit had stirred the silt at the bottom of their pond. After the boys were bathed, stories read, and finally asleep in Asher's room, a camp-out night, Zuri and Kofi sat on the porch with glasses of wine. The night was clear and cold. "She looked lost," Zuri said finally, breaking the silence. "She is lost," Kofi replied, his voice low. "Her lawyer called me last week. She's moving to California, some yoga retreat job that probably won't last. She's signing over her visitation rights to not disrupt his stability." He took a long drink. "It's for the best, but it still feels like a failure. A different kind." "Not yours," Zuri said firmly. "You've given Micah everything. Stability, love, a brother. That's the opposite of failure." He nodded, but the sadness lingered in his eyes.
Sometimes I look at him and Asher, and I'm so grateful for what we have. And then I think it exists because of such profound brokenness. No, Zuri said, turning to face him. The porch light cast soft shadows on his face. It exists because we chose to build something from the brokenness. We could have just walked away, two separate, bitter people. We chose this. We built this. She gestured towards the house where their sons slept. That's the story, Kofi, not the breaking, the building. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the sadness in his eyes softened into something else. A profound gratitude, a deep, abiding respect that had, over the years, become the bedrock of their lives. "You're right, Zuzu," he said, using Micah's name for her, and it sounded like an endearment. "As always." The following spring, a different piece of the past resurfaced, this time with legal finality. Brenda called. Omari had filed for a modification of his child support, claiming financial hardship. In the process, his lawyer had inadvertently revealed that Omari was facing a lawsuit from the dealership, not for the accident, but for financial irregularities. Embezzlement, it seemed. The golden boy had not only crashed the car, but had also been skimming from the till. His life was in free fall. The modification hearing was a grim affair. Zuri attended with Brenda, not out of need, but out of a desire to see it through, to witness the final act of a play that had long since lost its power to move her. Omari looked shrunken, his expensive suit hanging loosely. He avoided her eyes entirely. His new wife, the woman from the grocery store, was not present. The judge, after reviewing the evidence of his misconduct versus his obligations, actually increased his support payments, tying them to future earnings. It was a Pyrrhic victory. As they left the courthouse, Brenda shook her head. "He'll probably declare bankruptcy. You may not see a dime, but the order is on the books." Standing on the courthouse steps in the brilliant Atlanta sunlight, Zuri felt nothing. No schadenfreude, no pity, just a distant acknowledgement, like reading a news headline about a stranger in a faraway city. Omari Vance was no longer a character in her story. He was a footnote, a minor creditor. Walking to her car, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Kofi with a photo attached. It was a picture of Asher and Micah in the backyard, covered in mud, grinning triumphantly next to a lopsided, freshly dug hole. The caption read, "Archaeologists have discovered what they believe to be a rare dinosaur bone, requires expert analysis, and hosing off." Zuri laughed, a clear, free sound that echoed in the sterile civic plaza. She typed back, "On my way, tell the experts to contain the artifact." This was her life. Not the sterile courtroom, but the muddy backyard. Not the hollowed-out ghost of a man she once loved, but the vibrant, present reality of the family she had built. The past had tried to reclaim her, first through Nala's desperate visit, then through Omari's legal entanglements. But it had failed. It had no anchor in her anymore. That night, after the mud-caked archaeologists were clean and asleep, Zuri sat at her kitchen table looking at a new design project on her laptop. Kofi was in the living room reading a report. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. She thought about the word family. It once meant a specific, narrow thing. A husband, a wife, a child on the way, in a nursery painted with sunlight yellow. That family was a beautiful fiction, a glass castle built on sand. What she had now was not a castle, but a living tree. Its roots were tangled and grew from damaged soil, but they were deep and strong, gripping the earth with fierce tenacity. Its branches, her, Kofi, Asher, Micah, spread wide, offering each other shelter and space to grow. It was not a perfect picture. It was complex, unconventional, and bore the scars of its origins. But it was real. It was resilient. It was hers. And as she saved her design file and closed her laptop, listening to the comfortable silence of her full, imperfect, and glorious home, Zuri Vance knew with absolute certainty that she had won, not by defeating anyone, but by building something that could never be broken. The phone had rung on a quiet afternoon 5 years ago, slicing through a silence filled with anticipation. Now, the silence was filled with a different,
deeper music, the sound of a life, faithfully and fiercely lived. The quiet contentment of Zuri's life became its own kind of fortress, not one to build things out, but to shelter the precious reality within. The twin visitations from the past, Nala's wearied appearance and Omari's crumbling spectacle in court, served as final, clarifying echoes. They were not threats, but confirmations. She had chosen the right path, the path of building, not dwelling. Years continued their gentle, relentless march. Asher and Micah grew from mud-covered archaeologists into lanky pre-tweens, their bond evolving but never diminishing. They attended the same middle school, were in different classes, but shared a core group of friends who never questioned their brotherhood. They had their own disagreements now, more complex than blue cups and peas. Arguments over video game strategies, borrowed sweatshirts not returned, whose turn it was to take out the compost. They were normal brothers. Kofi's townhouse remained 3 streets away, but the line between the two households grew increasingly porous. The boys had drawers and toothbrushes in both places. Sunday dinners, once scheduled event, became a near daily occurrence, migrating between kitchens depending on who had the better ingredients or the clearer schedule. Zuri's graphic design business flourished, allowing her to convert the sunlit room off the porch into a proper studio. Kofi became a senior project manager, his calm, methodical nature proving invaluable. Their lives were not merged, but they were harmonized, a duet played in 2 separate but adjacent rooms. One Saturday afternoon, when the boys were 13, Zuri found herself alone in her studio, finishing a logo for a local bakery. The house was quiet. Asher and Leica were at a basketball clinic, and Kofi was running errands. The doorbell chimed. A rare sound in the middle of a weekend when the house was usually a hub of noise. On the porch stood a delivery man with an envelope requiring a signature. It was thick, legal-sized, and bore the return address of a firm she didn't recognize. A cold trickle of apprehension ran down her spine, a ghost of a feeling from another life. She signed for it, took it to the kitchen table, and opened it with careful fingers. It was from an estate attorney. The letter was concise, formal. It informed her that Emory Vance had passed away 2 weeks prior. The cause was listed as complications from a chronic illness. He had been living in a rented room in a suburb she'd never heard of. He had no significant assets. Among his few personal effects was a small, locked metal box. The instructions attached to it stated it was to be delivered to Zuri Vance for their son, Asher. The attorney offered his condolences and requested instructions for the transfer of the item. Zuri sat down, the papers smooth and cool under her fingertips. Omari was dead. The fact landed not with a crash, but with a soft, final thud, like a distant door closing in a very large house. She felt a sadness, but it was a generic human sadness, the sadness for a life that had spiraled into such loneliness and ruin. There was no love left to mourn, no unfinished business to grieve. There was just the stark, quiet end of a story that had diverged from hers long ago. When Kofi came home, she showed him the letter. He read it silently, then placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I'll do it. For Asher." The box arrived a few days later, a small, gunmetal gray strongbox dented at one corner. It felt light. There was a small key taped to the top. Zuri didn't open it. She waited until Sunday evening when the boys were doing homework at the dining table, the familiar, companionable silence of multiplication worksheets and history readings filling the room. "Asher," she said, her voice softer than usual, "can you come here for a minute?" He looked up, curious. Micah glanced over too, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Zuri placed the box on the table. "This came for you, from your biological father's lawyer. He passed away recently." Asher's face went still. His relationship with Omari had been, at best, a confusing abstraction. The monthly visits had stopped years ago when Omari's life grew too unstable to manage them. Asher had asked fewer and fewer questions. Now he looked at the box as if it were an artifact from a history class. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know. It was for you." She handed him the key. With Kofi and Micah looking on, Asher fitted the key into the lock and turned it. The click was loud in the quiet room. He lifted the lid. Inside, there were no jewels, no stacks of money, no heartfelt confessional letters. There was a single worn leather wallet and a small framed photograph. Asher picked up the photograph. It was of Zuri, heavily pregnant, standing in the doorway of their old apartment's nursery holding up the yellow onesie. She was smiling, a radiant, unguarded smile of pure anticipation. The photo was taken from an angle that suggested it was a candid shot, one she never knew had been taken. It was a snapshot of a moment before the fall, a moment of hope that was entirely real. Beneath it, in the wallet, was Asher's own newborn hospital bracelet, its tiny plastic band faded, a dried pressed flower, a daisy maybe, and a single folded piece of lined notebook paper. Asher unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but recognizable as Omari's. Asher, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I won't waste your time with excuses. They're worthless. I made choices that broke something beautiful, and I spent every day after that trying and failing to glue the pieces back together. The pieces were never mine to fix. The woman in this picture is the best person I ever knew. I loved her, but love isn't a feeling, it's an action. I failed at the action. My greatest regret is that my failure put a distance between you and her, even for a little while. Don't let any distance stay. The bracelet is to remind you that you started pure and new. The flower is from the park where I used to watch you play once, from very far away. You looked happy. I have nothing of value to leave you, except this, a warning from a man who got it wrong. Don't build your life on lies, even small ones. Don't take the people who love you for granted. And if you're ever lucky enough to have a family that feels like a safe harbor, protect it with everything you are. I am sorry for all of it. Be a better man than I was. Oh. Asher read the note slowly, then handed it silently to Zuri. She read it, her throat tight. She passed it to Kofi, who read it and gave a slow, deep nod, as if acknowledging a painful truth finally spoken. Asher picked up the photograph again, studying the image of his mother, young and glowing with him still in her. He kept this? He asked, his voice young and old at once. It seems so, Zuri said softly. It's a good picture of you, Zuzu, Micah said, leaning over to look, breaking the tension with his characteristic, grounded kindness. Asher looked from the photo to the note, then closed the box. He didn't seem sad, exactly. Thoughtful. Resolved. Okay, he said, the word a period at the end of a very short, very strange chapter. Later that night, after the boys were in bed, Zuri and Kofi sat on the back porch. The air was warm, carrying the scent of jasmine from the neighbor's fence. What will he do with it? Kofi asked. I think he'll keep it, in a drawer. It's a piece of his puzzle, even if it's a dark piece. Maybe especially because it's a dark piece. She looked at him. It was a better ending than I thought he'd have, to finally tell a kind of truth. Kofi nodded. The only thing he could give. Years later, on the weekend of Asher's high school graduation, they threw a party that spilled from Zuri's house into the backyard and down the street. Friends, colleagues, Asher's teachers, Micah's soccer team. The crowd was a vibrant tapestry of the life they'd woven. Asher, tall and confident, with his mother's smile and a thoughtful glint in his eye that was all his own, moved through the throng accepting congratulations. Micah, equally tall but more reserved, was his shadow, handing him drinks and deflecting well-meaning aunts with expert ease. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in watercolor streaks of orange and purple, Zuri stood by the fence, watching her son. Kofi came to stand beside her, handing her a glass of lemonade. We did it, he said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact.
Zuri looked at him, at the streaks of silver in his hair, at the lines of laughter and worry around his eyes that she knew as well as her own. She looked at Asher, laughing with a group of friends, and at Micah chatting with Zuri's mother. She looked at the house, the garden, the life. We did, she said, her voice thick with an emotion too vast and complex to name. It was gratitude and triumph and peace, all woven together. The story that had begun with a phone call slicing through a silent nursery had ended here,
not in silence, but in the rich, joyful noise of a family celebrating. The betrayal had been the catalyst, but it was not the theme. The theme was resilience. The theme was choice. The theme was the quiet, daily act of building love upon the foundation of truth, however painful that truth had been to uncover. Asher caught her eye from across the yard and raised his cup in a small salute. She raised hers back. The phone had rung, the world had shattered, and from the glittering pieces, she had not just rebuilt a life, she had built a better one. The final, complete truth was not about what had been lost in that hospital hallway so long ago, but about everything that had been gained, piece by careful piece, in all the days and years that followed. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.